Recording Sylvia Rivera. Original name Ray Rivera Mendoza.
There's a P in my name also. They call me Marsha Payne on my Jessica. I try and pay a lot of those things that happen to me in life. Absolutely no mind.
And yes, I've had a very hard struggle. I tell these stories of my life because I know that my children, in later years, my transgender community will understand.
I was one of the Stonewall girls, one of the first girls to ever come in drags to the Stonewall. 1969, when the Stonewall riot started, that's when I started my little rioting.
We have to stand up and speak for ourselves. We have to fight for ourselves. We were the front liners of the so-called 1969 rebellion.
The Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street in New York City was a common LGBT meeting place. On the night of June 28, 1969, Sylvia Rivera was a teenage drag queen new to the Stonewall scene. Marsha P. Johnson was a Stonewall regular, stopping in for an evening of celebration. Both queens were homeless and on their own, like many of the queer youth who congregated at the city bar.
By 1969, when we see the riots at the Stonewall Inn, the uprising, we have a situation where people are congregating for an evening of leisure, of pleasure, of sociability, and they are tired of being bullied by police. If you were picked up in one of these raids, you could expect to have your name and home address and your employer in the newspaper. People were outed, they lost their jobs, their families found out things that they hadn't told their families. It was really devastating.
Marsha Johnson said, "I got my civil rights," and then threw a shot glass into a mirror, and that started the riots. In GAA, this became known as the shot glass that was heard around the world.
Just after 3 a.m., police began a raid of the bar. Several arrests were made at random, and the offenders were forcibly escorted from the building in handcuffs. The conflict quickly turned violent as bystanders on the street began throwing bottles at police. Sylvia Rivera is credited with having thrown the first bottle, while proclaiming, "I'm not missing a minute of this. It's the revolution."
We have more and more local gay rights organizations, gay community groups forming in cities throughout the country after Stonewall. So that's where I think the importance lies. And part of that is that they started holding this march or this celebration every June on the anniversary of the Stonewall riots.
Marsha and Sylvia's role in the uprising marked the beginning of their activism and the start of a deep partnership. Together they sought to improve the lives of other homeless queer youth in New York City.
I started the Star House, but I didn't actually start the Star House. Sylvia Rivera started the Star House, and I was just one of the queens that was behind her, like the vice president of Star.
STAR stood for Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. It was the joint effort of Marsha and Sylvia to provide a home for trans youth and to unify and protest.
And they had managed to get some small-time mobster who ran a porno store to give them an apartment or something in the Lower East Side in this slum building, which for a few months they operated as a shelter for homeless transgender youth. And they felt that that was one of their great accomplishments in life.
Folks like Marsha and Sylvia faced sort of double discrimination. They were facing rejection and stigma and harassment from the outside straight cisgender world, but they were also facing rejection from oftentimes the gay rights, the LGBTQ rights movement writ large. There's a video of a really powerful speech that Sylvia Rivera gave at a rally where she sort of addressed head on the fact that the leaders of the movement at that time in the late 60s and 70s really rejected trans people as a part of the movement and threw transgender people aside because they felt like it wasn't politically expedient or that trans people were a liability.
Sylvia left the movement after the first three or 4 years because in this very park she had been refused the right to speak.
No, you all tell me to go and hide my tail between my legs. will not no longer put up with this shit. I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck's wrong with you all?
Despite their achievements, the two queens continued to face many obstacles because they were homeless, transgender women of color. Though initially the crowd booed Sylvia, by the end of her speech, she had them chanting with her, "Gay power." Marsha P. Johnson continued to march in the Pride Parade every year until the end of her life.
I believe in as long as there's people with AIDS, and as long as gay people don't have their rights all across America, there's no reason for celebration. That's how come I walk every year. That's how come I've been walking for gay rights all these years instead of riding in cars and celebrating everything. Because you never completely have your rights, one person, until you all have your rights. And I figure as long as there's one gay person that has to walk for gay rights, Don, all of us should be walking for gay rights.
On July 6, 1992, Marsha's body was found in the Hudson River. Her death was ruled a suicide, but the circumstances were incredibly shadowy, and many believe it was a murder. To this day, the case remains unsolved. Hundreds of people marched down Christopher Street at her funeral to deliver her ashes to the river. Sylvia entered a deep depression after Marsha's death, but emerged with new vigor and rejoined the LGBT rights movement. In her later years, she was the director of a food pantry at a local church.
I call these, but I have them lined up like this, my soldiers to fight hunger. That's my little nickname.
She died of liver cancer in 2002. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were the driving force behind the early LGBT rights movement. So why don't we hear more about them?
As I do my reading, I don't see their names come up that much. I don't learn as much about them as I'd like. Certainly, what I've seen are transgender historians and activists of the last 10 years, working really hard to recover these stories, to create a usable past for the transgender movement of today.
No, I don't think Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera get the recognition that they deserve. I don't think any of the folks who were involved in the Stonewall riots get the recognition that they deserve. I hope that more and more people learn about the contributions of Sylvia and Marsha, that we understand the history of this movement, and that we never forget it as we move forward.
Today we look to Marsha and Sylvia as heroes in the LGBT community. They were shining examples of advocacy and stood up for their rights. And we remember the important work they did that still shapes the community today.
I think all of the work that we do in the shadow of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and the Stonewall riots. We also, as a community, though, do need to remember that our modern movement begun as an uprising against police-involved violence. And so we need to remember, as we're moving forward, that legacy that we carry with us. Approach our work with that mindset, right? Approaching our work, making sure that we're intersectional, making sure that we're recognizing that LGBTQ people are also women, we're also people of color, we're also people with disabilities, Muslims, immigrants, and that when any one of us are attacked, we're all attacked. We need to make clear that Black Lives Matter in our work. We need to make clear that undocumented people in this country deserve dignity and protection. We need to make clear that women or people who need access to reproductive health are able to access all of the services that they need to live and thrive. And so I think that Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson and their involvement underscore the intersectional work of this effort. They were two trans women of color protesting police-involved violence. If that's not an example of intersectionality, then I don't know what is, and that is something that we have to remember moving forward.